All right. Hello, Nutrition 101 students. So this week we'll be diving into chapter 3, which is all about how we get our food into our body and to the cells that need it. Right. So we'll be covering the processes of ingestion, digestion, and absorption. And ingestion is simply how we get our food into our body. Digestion will then be how our body breaks apart that food into these smaller pieces of parts that we can then absorb or get into our cells, into our bloodstream, to the cells throughout the rest of the body that are ultimately going to need those building blocks and that energy to do their work. So starting off, we'll just quickly go over ingestion. So we'll be talking about why we eat, some ultimate answers like overall, why are we eating, some proximate answers as to like the feelings, and in the moment answers to why we eat. So let's get started. So before we actually get into ingestion, I want to give a quick preface or I guess a bit of a reminder on energy, because I've brought this up a few times throughout the course. But energy is a part of our entire metabolism. So everything that your bodies do is going to require some sort of energy and is going to transform energy in some way. So from one form into another. Even when you are at your most relaxed, rested state, your body is still working. It is still, chemical reactions are still occurring, and metabolism is still active. And so energy is always going to be a required part of our body. It's something that our cells are always going to need access to. But energy is neither created nor destroyed. This is a part of that first law of thermodynamics, that the total amount of energy that exists in this universe is constant. We are simply transforming that energy from one form into another. So for instance, from energy from the photons that come from the sun, plants can transform that energy into ATP, which can be used to store energy into a large molecule like a carbohydrate. We as consumers are essentially always taking that stored energy from some molecule like a carbohydrate, lipid, or protein, and then releasing it and storing it into a different molecule like ATP, which can then power some other process in the cell. So we're always just transferring energy from one form into another. And a small part of energy, or a small piece of the energy that is going to be used in every chemical reaction, will be lost from that system. So a result of all energy transfers, every time energy is moved from one form to another, is going to produce some heat. And heat is essentially lost energy to the environment. Right? It is disordered, unharnessed kinetic energy. And you can think of kinetic energy as energy that is being actively used to do something. Right? Like a boulder rolling down a hill is exerting kinetic energy on everything that it is impacting. Right? Some force, that energy is being actively used. As opposed to potential energy, which you can think of as that stored energy. So molecules store energy in the bonds that are holding them together, and that potential energy that is being stored in that bond can be released as kinetic energy by breaking the bond. But again, along the way, anytime energy is being transformed, some of it is going to be lost. So the least amount of steps that can be taken from source to end results, the most efficient or the most amount of energy that is going to be kept in that system. So the shorter process or the less steps, the more efficient that process is going to be, because less energy will be lost as heat. Anyways, so our goals with eating is to take the resources within our food, so the building blocks for our cells to make larger molecules and make more cells, the vitamins and minerals that are going to be utilized to assist and drive a lot of our metabolic processes, and then energy that is important to allow those things to occur. So we're trying to get these three things ultimately from our food in order to be able to grow, to repair our cells, and to allow us to do work. So why do we want to eat? There are two different factors or two different sides that drive us to eat. We have our psychological desire, which is our appetite. These are cravings to eat. This is not hunger, which is our physiological desire, the physical feeling of needing to eat. Right? So discerning between these two is kind of the main point here. So we have a psychological desire, that appetite, which can have nothing to do with how hungry we are, can have nothing to do with our cells actually needing access to anything. It is more strongly driven simply by desire to have some food, desire to get some sugar or eat something salty. Right? Our hunger is that internally derived physical response, physiological or physical response driving us to eat. Right? So hunger will result from the fact that our cells are low on access to a particular resource or low in access to energy, and thus can stimulate the feeling of hunger. So for instance, we have mechanoreceptors in our stomach that react to low amount of pressure. So your stomach is surrounded by 3 different layers of soft muscle that essentially help squeeze the stomach or move the stomach from all directions. And so when the stomach is empty and those muscles are constricted quite tightly because there's nothing filling that space, our cells can respond to that low pressure and release hormones that will communicate to our brain that, hey, we're low on food, and so we need to eat more. And so satiety is kind of the opposite of hunger. It is that feeling of fullness. So when you are sated, you are feeling full. And so in the same way that we have systems in place to notify our brains and thus the rest of our body that we are feeling hungry, similarly, we have hormones that can send the signal that we are done, we are full, we don't need any more, and thus can stop eating. And this is going to be impacted by all of our sensations. And so taste is obviously a huge one. It's going to play a role. So our sensation of what is in our mouth and what is getting into our bodies, but all of our senses can play a role in not just our feeling of hunger, but also satiety. Right. So we have mechanoreceptors, like those that I was pointing out are in our stomach, that can tell us that we're hungry. And then we also have chemoreceptors. So these are what respond to the chemicals that are available. And so taste is essentially a reaction to molecules that we have labeled as tastants. These are proteins that stimulate those taste chemoreceptors. Odorants are the proteins or molecules that stimulate our sense of smell. Thoughts of food can stimulate these chemical receptors. Blood sugar is a big one that will drive your feeling of hunger or fullness. Right? So if you have a low amount of glucose in your blood, your cells will release the hormone insulin, which essentially delivers the message to your brain that you need more food because we don't have enough sugar to deliver to all of our cells, and our cells need that sugar for energy, and so it's time to get more sugar. Right? So these signal the brain that blood sugar is low, and you are hungry, and or will stimulate that psychological feeling of appetite. So if you're smelling a food that you have a memory connection in your brain that makes you happy, that could stimulate your appetite and thus encourage you to consume that food, whether you actually are physically hungry or low on nutrients. That appetite could still be stimulated. So that is typically related to thought. Right? It is a conscious reaction. Right? So you would typically be aware of what had created that feeling. Right? You were aware that you smelled that food or heard something that reminded you of food, and etc. So any of those unconscious reactions that you cannot control mentally, you do not have thoughts about, right, are hunger. Okay. So the hypothalamus region of the brain can receive electrical signals from our nerves in response to something like those mechanoreceptors in our stomach and the chemical signals that we were just talking about. And so in response, or a majority of our response, or a majority of our signaling throughout our body is a result of the hormones that are being secreted. So throughout this chapter, we're going to introduce you to a lot of different hormones that play a role in this process. Whoops, sorry. So insulin is an example of one of those hormones. It's a long-range chemical messenger that can travel through our blood from whatever cell it was released from to a target cell somewhere on the other side of our body, and thus elicit a response. Glucagon is another example of a hormone that might be released in response to blood glucose levels. And these typically come from our pancreas, or majority of our insulin and glucagon comes from our pancreas, which is a assistant organ throughout our digestive process, throughout our digestive tract. Sorry. Right. So as I just mentioned, hormones are long-range chemical messengers. So these can be either proteins or lipids that are able to travel throughout the body and then will be received by some receptor protein on the outside of another cell and thus stimulate a response. So these are produced by specialized glands throughout the body. And as I said, they can travel long distances, right? There are lots of other types of signals that our cells can release that are short distance signals, and hormones are the main ones that will actually travel throughout the body to some other tissue instead of just communicating with their neighboring cells. And so we have hormones that produce the feeling of hunger and or will encourage glucose uptake by our cells, such as insulin. Right? So when your blood glucose level is low, your pancreas releases insulin. Insulin will bind with insulin receptors on some of the cells throughout your body, thus telling them to start taking glucose out or out of the bloodstream, or to start releasing some of their glycogen or stored glucose so that there's more available. And some hormones can produce the feeling of satiety or fullness, that you are done eating. So for instance, fats will stimulate the release of cholecystokinin or CCK. Don't worry about learning that full name. You'll just see CCK throughout a majority of this course. CCK travels through the blood until it is received by another type of receptor specific for that hormone, and thus tells you that you are full and decreases that physical feeling of hunger. So we have that hormonal control that can regulate our hunger and appetite, and we also have our nervous control. So the medulla oblongata is a portion of our brainstem that is our reflex center, and this will integrate the messages that are being translated from our nerves throughout our body, and then we'll kind of double check it with some of our higher control centers, such as the hypothalamus in our brain, and then send a signal back out to the body. And I guess I skipped over this bullet point here, but typically that bodily response, or that signal that is being sent back to the body, is going to those specialized glands and telling them to start releasing a particular type of hormone or secreting that particular type of hormone. So in the same way that we have signals telling us to start eating, telling us that we are hungry, or stimulating appetite, we also have signals that are stimulating satiety. And our different macronutrient molecules have differing effects on that feeling of satiety based on when and where they are digested, how long it takes to digest that particular molecule, how much space they take up, etc. So proteins take a long time to digest. They have to make it all the way to the small intestine before we can actually start absorbing any of our proteins into our bloodstream, because the only enzymes that our body produces to create enzyme or to destroy proteins, through our digestive tract are released into the small intestine. So until they get to that organ, they are not being broken down to a smaller size and then absorbed. So they can take a long time, and therefore they are more likely to make you feel full. Fats, similar to proteins, are mostly digested in the small intestine, and they're very energy dense, so they similarly can increase that feeling of satiety. And then carbohydrates are going to vary greatly by type and concentration. We have a little bit of amylase, the enzyme that can break down carbohydrates in our saliva. There's a little bit of amylase that gets released into our stomach. So carbohydrates can be absorbed as early as our stomach in small amounts. And so depending on the type, so simple sugars will be absorbed very quickly and get into the blood very quickly. But some of the larger, more complex sugars like starch will take a bit longer in order to fully break them apart into their individual monosaccharides and then absorb them into the bloodstream. And then lastly, foods with lots of fiber are going to promote satiety very significantly. So fiber is an extremely dense type of sugar or type of carbohydrate that we typically cannot actually digest. So fiber will typically make it all the way to the large intestine before being broken down, if it is digested and broken down at all. And so that fiber is going to take up space, help push on those mechanoreceptors, and stimulate the feeling of fullness and satiety. And so along with that same idea of how much space these foods are taking, how concentrated they are, solid foods are going to be more filling than semi-solid or liquid foods. Okay? And so once this food has gotten into our body, how is it actually getting into our cells, right? So ingestion was just getting the food into our body. So essentially putting it into our mouth and then sending it down the esophagus. We have now ingested your food. But once you've done that, how is it actually going to get to the cells that need it, right? Our bodies are huge. We have 10 to 100 trillion human cells in our body that are going to need access to those molecules and that energy. And so how do we get it there from this one series of organs that are going to be breaking it down? And so the first stage in that process is making them smaller. Right? Most of the food you are eating contains these nutrients and molecules that are much too large to actually cross any cell membranes. And so the first goal is to break down those molecules into a small enough pieces and parts that we can then actually get them across a cell membrane into your intestinal cells, and then from those intestinal cells across another membrane to get into your bloodstream, and then carried through the bloodstream to get to the target cells, and then finally across, another membrane or two in order to get to where their final destination is. Right? So we have to get the food into our body. We have to break it down into the tiniest pieces and parts that we can, and then get those pieces across some cell membranes and into the bloodstream. So, right, I just said this: carbs, proteins, fats, and vitamins. So a majority of the nutrients that we're trying to get from our food are very large molecules. And so we need to disassemble these large molecules into smaller molecules. And so a quick flashback to when we were talking about cell bio and nutrition overview. We have two different categories of metabolism: catabolism and anabolism. Catabolism is the process of breaking large molecules apart. Anabolism is the process of building large molecules from smaller pieces. So digestion is an example of catabolism, taking these large molecules, trying to interrupt as many bonds between them as possible to get them into smaller, tinier molecules, and then sending them somewhere else where they may be part of anabolism, building something larger. But digestion is catabolism. Okay. So once we've broken those large molecules into smaller molecules, we then need to absorb them. So cross cellular membranes into our intestinal cells, and then finally into the bloodstream, where they can be delivered to the cells throughout the body that need them. And then those cells can use those molecules to provide energy or build other cells. Right? So that would be anabolism. And so essentially, we're taking those large macronutrients and trying to break them down to the monomers that we talked about in the last chapter. So carbohydrates, we're trying to break them down into the individual smallest version of a carbohydrate, which is a monosaccharide. Lipids are being broken down into their fatty acid tails or monoglycerides, which is a single glyceride with one fatty acid tail. Most of the fats that we're putting into our body are coming into our body as triglycerides. So we're essentially just separating tails from that glycerol head. And then the proteins that we're ingesting, we're trying to break all the way down to the individual amino acids that make them up. And most proteins are thousands of amino acids long, right? So there's a lot of digesting to do in order to get them down to a single amino acid. And then again, that final step after digestion, so after these molecules have been broken down into their monomers, we then need to absorb them. And so some molecules can simply diffuse across the plasma membrane. So if there's a high concentration of them in one of our organs, like the small intestine, that will drive them to simply move into where there is space inside of our intestinal cells. Some are going to require help from proteins, so facilitated diffusion, where there is a concentration gradient driving the movement of that molecule, but it cannot diffuse across the membrane, so a protein would have to help it get into that cell. And then lastly, we'll have active transport, which is a similar process in that a protein is being used to move a molecule from one side of a membrane to another. But active transport is going to require energy because the molecule is large, or because we're moving that molecule against its concentration gradient. So there may actually be more of that type of molecule inside the cell but we need to get it out of our small intestine and into the intestinal cell so that it can eventually get into the bloodstream, and thus we use energy to kind of override that natural force. Okay. So that is all for this portion of chapter 3. In the next video, we will start talking about the process of digestion, so the process of breaking apart all these large molecules and what that looks like for each of the macronutrients we've been talking about.